Have you ever buried a loved one, only to hear them walk back into your house the same night? My dear, this isn't a ghost story. This happened to me in a small town in Ohio. Before I tell you what I saw, hit that like button and subscribe, because once you hear this, you'll never sleep the same again. I live in a quiet town near Youngstown, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your business, where church bells mark the hours, and where the wind carries secrets through the trees. When my husband Harold passed away, the whole town came to the funeral. He was a coal miner, tough, honest, and stubborn. We buried him in St. Anthony's Cemetery, right under the oak tree that loses its leaves earlier than all the others. That day, the rain poured as if heaven itself was mourning. The priest read the prayers, the choir sang, and I watched as they lowered the man I had loved for 52 years into the cold, wet ground. But Ohio has a way of holding on to the dead. That night, the house was too quiet. You see, when you've lived with someone for over half a century, silence isn't comforting, it's deafening. I sat in Harold's armchair, clutching his cane. The old clock on the wall ticked so loud it felt like a hammer against my skull. And then I heard it. The floorboard in the hallway creaked. At first, I told myself it was the house settling. Our home was over 100 years old. After all, but then another creak, and another. My breath caught in my chest. My ears strained, and then, soft as a whisper, the smell of Harold's cologne drifted through the room. That deep, woody scent he wore every Sunday to church. But Harold was 6 feet underground. I told myself I was grieving, that my mind was tricking me. The second night, I locked every window, every door. I placed my Bible open on the dining table. I even left the hall light on like a frightened child. Still, I heard the sound. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of Harold's cane against the wooden floor. I froze. My whole body trembled. The sound moved slowly down the hall, until it stopped right outside our bedroom door. But when I opened it, nothing. Just the empty bed where he once slept. By the third night, it wasn't just footsteps. On the bathroom mirror, after my shower, words appeared in the steam. I'm not gone. My blood ran cold. I screamed for my daughter the next morning, begging her to stay with me. She laughed nervously, told me grief was twisting my mind. Mama, you're in Ohio. Half these old houses creak and moan when the wind blows. But grief doesn't write words in steam. And grief doesn't leave muddy footprints in the living room, the exact same boots Harold was buried in. That night, I was too scared to sleep. I sat with the rosary in my hand, praying over and over again. And then it happened. A voice, low, drawn out, right behind my ear. Margaret. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the rosary. No one was there, but the mirror across the room began to fog, though the air was still and cold. And in that fog, a shadow moved. My dear friends, that's when I knew. My husband had come back to me, but not as the man I buried. No, something else had taken his place. And what happened the next night? I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. You know, grief does strange things to the mind. That's what I told myself after those first nights. But when the dead start walking in your house, it's not grief. It's not imagination. It's something else. And I was about to learn that in the most terrifying way. By the fourth night after Harold's burial, the house didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a trap, quiet, waiting, holding its breath. I woke up to the smell of damp soil. At first I thought maybe the basement had flooded. But no, the smell was too strong. It clung to my sheets, filled my nose, coated my tongue. And then I realized it was the smell of the cemetery, the smell of freshly turned earth. The bed dipped beside me, as if someone had just laid down. I turned my head slowly, praying I would see nothing. But there was an imprint on the pillow next to mine. Like a head was resting there. I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled as I reached out, only to touch cold, damp fabric. A sleeve that felt just like the suit Harold was buried in. I screamed, "The neighbor's here." The next morning, Mrs. Carter from across the street knocked on my door. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I heard you yelling last night." I wanted to tell her everything, that Harold had come back, that he was lying in bed beside me though his coffin was in the ground. But her eyes told me she wouldn't believe me. So I lied. "Just a bad dream," I said. Her hand lingered on mine. "You should see Father Donnelly," she whispered. "Sometimes grief opens doors it shouldn't." Those words haunted me. Open doors. Doors that couldn't be closed again. The fifth night. The visitor. That night I heard it again. the sound of Harold's cane tapping slow and steady down the hallway. But this time, the tapping stopped outside the front door. I crept down the stairs, clutching the rosary so tightly it cut into my palm. And then, through the stained glass of the door, I saw a shadow. A tall, familiar shape, broad shoulders, the tilt of his head. It was Harold. My breath caught. My heart screamed at me to run. But my feet moved toward the door. My hand reached for the knob. "Margaret," a voice whispered through the wood. "Let me in." Tears burned my eyes. My husband's voice. The same deep tone, the same softness he used when we were young. But something was wrong. His voice carried an echo, like two voices layered together. "Margaret, let me in." I snatched my hand away. The shadow at the door shifted. The knob turned on its own. I screamed the Lord's Prayer until my throat bled. And just like that, the shadow vanished. But on the porch the next morning, I found mud. Mud and footprints leading straight from St. Anthony's Cemetery to my door. The sixth night, no one believes. I begged my daughter to stay again. "Mama," she said firmly, "you need sleep. You need medicine. This isn't real." I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her. But how could I? How could I tell my only child that her father was clawing his way back into our lives? So I stayed alone. That night, the windows rattled, though the air was still. Every mirror in the house fogged up at once, and in each one I saw him, not standing behind me, but inside the reflection. His lips moved, over and over again, "I'm not gone." And then the glass cracked, every single mirror. The seventh night, the impossible. On the seventh night, 1 week after the burial, I finally broke. I boarded up the windows. I sprinkled holy water at every corner. I lit candles until the wax dripped down the table like blood. But at 3:07 a.m., the entire house went cold. My breath fogged the air. And then I heard him, not from the hallway, not from the mirror, but right next to me. "Margaret." I turned my head, and he was there. Not a shadow, not a whisper. Harold. His skin was pale, gray. Dirt clung to his hair, his fingernails. His eyes, once kind, were glassy, empty, yet burning with hunger. He reached out his hand, and in that moment I didn't see my husband. I saw something wearing his body like a mask. I ran. People think the dead bring peace, that they bring closure. But what came into my home that night was not peace. It was hunger. It wanted me, and when I slammed the door on it, it didn't stop. Oh no, it began scratching. And the scratches. They never stopped. Would you have opened the door? Would you let your dead loved one back into your home? Tell me below. There are moments you live through and know, with a clarity that makes your bones ache, that nothing will ever be the same afterward. For me, that moment was the night everything in my house turned against me. The night the thing in Harold's shape decided it would not be content to knock or whisper, but to claim the rest of my life. If you've been with me through the others, the funeral, the footprints on my porch, the fogged mirrors, you know the shape of what terror felt like. You have heard me ask whether this was the play of an old mind or the invasion of something older. Tonight I will stop asking as much and tell you what happened, exactly, step by step. If you live in Ohio, you'll argue with me in the comments. If you don't, you'll call me a liar or a prophet. Either way, keep your wits. This story is not for idle ears. The days after the last things I told you were measured in a kind of ragged, sleepless time. I barricaded doors with furniture. I slept in clothes, rosary in hand. I smeared salt in the sills. I read psalms until my voice was raw. I tried to be rational. Maybe the caretaker at the cemetery had made a mistake. Maybe someone was playing a horrendous joke, but the house kept producing evidence that logic could not hold. Mud in the hall, the taste of earth in the air, the cane's tap that had once been a sound I loved, becoming an instrument of dread. What changed everything was the hour. It always came at the same slack, cruel point, 3:07 in the morning. It arrived like a clockwork sickness. The air would crouch in my lungs, and then, as if on cue, the house would inhale and the campaign would begin. The first time I felt something reach for me from the dark. It was a hand on my shoulder. The skin that touched me was cold as frozen soil and dry as autumn leaves. The ring on the finger, the ring I'd seen on Harold's hand for 52 years, was on a finger that left a smear of mud. When the hand tightened, I screamed until my throat bled. The neighbors banged on the walls, because we lived in a town where no one locked their doors and everyone listened. By dawn, the same morning sunlight that had once warmed the kitchen now revealed 5 crescent scratches, raked into my front door, as if something had tried to bore through to my living room from the outside. Those were there for anyone to see. You do not get marks like that from a trick of the mind. I tried to get help. I went to the priest, Father Donnelly, and his face when I told him was not one of a man who disbelieved. It was a face that had seen things on which he could not move easily. "Don't invite what you cannot bind," he said quietly. "Sometimes we open the wrong doors with words we mean to close." He wouldn't stay overnight in my house. He left me sacrament and a rosary and a warning. Do not respond. Do not name it. Do not let it think you are polite. But the thing outside the polite rules did not respect the boundaries of good counsel. It respected hunger. After the first week of the 307s and the scratched door, the house began to change its rules. The mirrors no longer reflected the same way. Reflections would lag half a beat, as if whatever looked back from them were trailing something invisible. Voices I loved curled out of the radio when static filled the dial. Once, I heard the record Harold used to play by the hearth, a scratchy waltz, and when it stopped I turned and the phonograph needle had never moved. It learned quickly. Any defense I erected seemed useful and then useless. Salt scattered at the thresholds would shift overnight into a neat pattern, as if some patients were arranging it like bones. Candles blew from within protective glass. The one thing that heralded real danger, the animal intelligence of it, was when it began to mimic other people's voices. That night, the one that still makes me drop my fork out of my hand when I tell it, it mimicked my daughter. She had not come. She had gone to her own bed 2 towns away. At 2:50 a.m., when the town's clocks chimed, a voice soft as a pillow came down the stairwell. "Mama, please open up. I'm so cold." Every mother reading this will know the exact way that voice makes your heart contract. I am sure wherever you are, you can hear it in some memory. I took 2 steps toward the door. Then something colder than a church stone wrapped my spine, because underneath that voice, like a bass note under a flute, Harold's voice hummed, "Let her in." I did not open the door. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. The timbre of the combined sound was unnatural. The voice layered itself, daughter over husband, and the door groaned like a throat. The figure at the glass moved with someone else's gait. When I pulled away, my hand left a print of sweat the shape of a palm, not mine. That was the night I understood how clever it was. It did not merely aim to frighten me. It wanted me to make choices I would later regret. It wanted me to decide, to perform the act of hospitality, which in our culture is holiness. It used my love as a trap. After that night, I tried things that sounded impossible. I played recordings of my own voice reading scripture back to the house. I let the radio play sermons from 3 parishes at once. I wrote the names of saints on every doorframe. I rang the old handbell Father Donnelly had given me until my knuckles were numb. It didn't matter. The thing used silence like a conductor's hand. It knew when my throat would tremble and used it. On the 7th day of the terror, there came a development that set the town talking. Early in the morning, Mrs. Carter from across the street found me at my mailbox. Hair matted, shoes wet with mud. I had been sitting there in the dark, waiting for some kind of explanation from the sky. "Margaret," she said with the bluntness of neighborly care. "Your door, look," she pointed. The ledger of scratches now had letters carved into the wood, 3 marks that read like initials. I do not have much of an imagination for secret writing. My hands shake just describing it. The letters were H-A-R. It looked like har, as in Harold, or a word beginning. When neighbors began to whisper, something in the house grew vindictive. People who had once dropped casseroles at my door stopped by less often. The good and the practical were replaced by those who wanted to see spectacle. The paper boys, the teenagers, a couple of men who fancied themselves braver than they were, all started to come by in the dusk to watch if the house would do anything for them. That was their mistake. There is a kindness to ordinary life that forbids voyeurism. The dark does not. One of those nights a group of boys came with flashlights, and one of them swore he saw a figure at the attic window, not moving, only watching like a dreamer looking into a shop. The group scattered when the figure lifted a hand and waved. The bravest boy, Jefferson, ran home and swore to his parents the house was cursed. The parents laughed him away from the pew. The next morning, Jefferson's mother came to my door. Her face had lines I hadn't seen before. "You need help," she said. In the old way people speak when they've been frightened into a seriousness. That same week, something else happened that finally convinced. Me, there was a pattern to this. Things cruelty. I woke to a sound like a child crying in the pantry. It was a sound that tightened bones. I went to the pantry and found one of our old quilts folded on the shelf. And on top of it, a single old photograph of Harold when he was young. A laugh frozen on his face and on the back, written in his hand, the date. I remember thinking, how does a dead man hold a pencil? How does anything hold a pencil? I will not pretend I was always brave. There were nights I stood in front of the heating stove and considered the simplest possible end to everything. You do not tell people this because they would cry and call you wicked. I tell you because truth is a debt and I owe you the truth. There was a temptation. There always is, I think, when a person is driven to the edge, to stop the voice by stopping the ear that listens. It is an ugly calculus. I will not speculate on what would have happened had I given in. I only know I did not. The thing also learned my grief and turned it inside out. It began to rearrange objects in the house to make tableau of things that hurt me. One morning, the crockery was stacked in the old cupboard in the shape of a coffin. My wedding photo, which usually sat on the mantel, was found face down in the sink with water poured into the frame until the glass fogged. The kitchen radio, which had always played jazz on summer afternoons, began to play a marching song that Harold used to hate. It was political in a way I could feel. It was his whole life's disagreeable punch played in the exact wrong key. Then came the scratching at the glass. One night the kitchen window fogged and words crawled in the condensation like small, drunk letters, "Come home." I pressed my palm to the glass. It was cold. I will not tell you I was not tempted. I will not claim that love was not a heavy chain. But there is a time when love must be allowed to lie down, however much it pleads, because the shape that pleads is not love at all. The community split. Some said the house was cursed and wanted it razed. Others said the woman had gone mad and needed a doctor. People put bets at the diner over whether I'd sell the place. In small towns, even the wrong kind of suffering becomes spectacle. In the 14th week, if memory serves me right, something happened that undermined everything I had underestimated. Father Donnelly called a meeting, not at the church, but at my kitchen table. He brought along the deacon, Mrs. Carter, and a man named Paul who had been the cemetery caretaker for 40 years. Paul had a face like a buried thing, lined, patient, used to the smell of damp soil. He had been in the ground more than he was out of it. Paul had a look when he came in. His hands were black from digging. He set a small wooden box on the table, and inside were a few things: a splinter of wood from a coffin lid, a bit of a rough rope, a coin. "We didn't find the body when we opened him," Paul said simply. "We found the bottom of the coffin torn out from the inside, marked like someone had tried to claw their way through." He shook his head. "I don't say such things lightly." Father Donnelly's eyes were steady. "It is not much to say what people call demon," he said. And he folded his hands like a surgeon folding a cloth. "But I will tell you what St. Augustine told me when I was insolent and young. Grief that refuses to lay down becomes a highway for things that hunger. Margaret, you cannot ally yourself to anger. You must ally yourself to the living." I wanted to argue. I wanted to blame the men who came with the flashlights. I wanted to scream that the dead had rights, that the dead had been unfaithful to us first. But in the small dark of my kitchen, with the box between us, something inside me realized how much I'd been fuel to this thing. It had used the community's curiosity and my own hunger for evidence to multiply itself. It had grown like mold on an old wall, eating whatever would let it spread. We made a plan. Father Donnelly would hold a mass in the house. We would keep vigil. We would not, under any circumstances, let voices outside decide for us what was holy. We would take the night and make it ours. We would pray together and not give space for the thing to speak. The vigils have a particular taste to them, faces lit by candle, the scent of incense, the rustle of hymn books, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. For many people, that is ritual and consolation. For me, it became blockade. "They prayed," I murmured. At 3:07, the house shuddered, candles guttered. The windows beat with a rhythm, not of wind, but of something knocking, as if someone pressed a fist against the glass in time, with a heart thrumming underground. We held. We did not answer the knocking. We did not open the door. We watched the living hold the line. The thing warmed itself on our fear, and then, in a sudden fashion I cannot explain, it did something I did not expect. It spoke in a voice I had not heard before. Not Harold's voice, not my daughter's, but a thin, slow voice like wind over planks. Why do you keep us from our own? It asked. The words made the teeth ache. It is one thing to hear a name you love. It is another to hear language that insists you owe them hospitality you did not invite. Father Donnelly stepped forward. His collar gleamed under candlelight. You are not his, he said. If he were, he would come with blessing. He would come to comfort. He would not tear. The voice chuckled like rain on a porch. Then Paul the caretaker did something unexpected. He took from the box an old scrap of paper, yellow with age, and read aloud a date. The grave was filled 48 hours before the moon changed, he said. It was filled when the ground was soft, but the lid shows scratches inside. This one clawed to be out. The night air seemed to hold its breath. At that the thing quieted. Not gone, but less emboldened around witnesses. The night passed with a silence that was almost exhausted. In the morning, the marks on the door were still there, the mud still damp. The men left with a seriousness that, for once, did not feel like gossip. They left with the solemnity of something that had been close to death and found its teeth. After that, the pattern shifted to something worse. It started to imitate not voices, but memories. Photographs would change. A photo of our wedding would show. Harold hand in someone else's. A letter I had written as a joke to a granddaughter would appear in my own handwriting as a confession. The house rewired our past into accusations. It made me doubt histories in ways that were precise and cruel. The thing wanted not merely to scare me if it wanted to fracture the foundation of who I knew myself to be. People began to speak of a final solution. A neighbor suggested we move. Another saw the house listed in a small-town online auction as part of an estate sale. The idea of leaving had a bright lure. Go away, and maybe the thing would stop. But to leave was to abandon something else. The history of a marriage. The bones of a life. A place where Harold's laughter had once rippled in the kitchen. It is remarkable what people attach themselves to. It is remarkable the ways love binds you to concrete and beams. Then, on the night that decided so much, something unexpected, and to me devastating, happened. My daughter came. She came with her car headlights off because she didn't want to wake the town, and she walked up the lane with a small overnight bag. She held her hands like a protection. She came because she'd been hearing talk and because there is something in the relationship between a parent and a child that cannot be killed by distance. When she opened the door, she looked at me with a face I did not know. "Mama," she said, "I'm here." Her voice was steady. There was no imitation. There was only the woman who had borne me grandchildren. When she hugged me, the house seemed temporarily less hungry. For a few hours we talked like people do who live through strange seasons. Practical plans, priest suggestions, lawyer options. She said things that were brave. She smoked the cigarette she hated when she was younger. She made coffee the way Harold had liked it. At 3:07 the house set itself. The candles flared and then went out. The radio turned on to static. The daughter pressed her back to mine, and I felt the press of 2 generations like armor. It stepped forward then, in the living room doorway. Not a silhouette, but a presence that wasted air. To look at it was to look at a thing that had worn life and stripped it. It did not speak first. It smiled. It reached a hand for my daughter's arm, and in that split of breath I made a choice. I stepped between them. It is not heroic to say so. I am not an action figure. I am a woman weathered by a lifetime. But the minute I placed my hand over my daughter's and put my body between a thing and someone, I love something in the world settled. Perhaps love does sometimes protect. Perhaps my love was simply a bait this thing hadn't understood. Hard to say. The thing moved its face close to mine. Up close I could see the soil in its teeth. It inhaled and its breath smelled of cedar and cold iron. For a terrifying moment, I recognized a face, not fully. Harold, but a composite of every man who had ever left and returned with an apology. It said, in a voice like knuckles on a coffin lid, "You shut me out." I said no. Then my daughter did something I will not forget. She stepped forward and put her hand on the thing's wrist, not in fear but in pity. "Who are you?" she asked, voice steady and very small. "If not him, what do you want from us?" For the first time, the thing faltered. The notion of being asked to identify itself, an identity the living know by name, seemed to puzzle it. It had been feeding on our rituals of naming. When asked to name itself, it struggled. It made a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. The thing's hand slipped from the daughter's arm and, for an impossible second, the eyes cleared and I saw the man I loved, not the echo. "Maggie," he said, a voice that was the combination of ocean and rope. "Come home." The woman who had raised me, who had given me bread when I was a child, who had stood beside Harold when he was sick, she did something monstrous or saintly or both. She stepped forward and did what people in myths do when the story requires it. She told a story back. She told of the day I had married Harold, of the way we had danced clumsily and laughed at the same fool. She told of the time my daughter had first sputtered the lisp of her name. She told of quiet, ordinary days when bread rose and the radio played. The thing listened. The thing was patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Then it did a thing that broke its pattern. It wept. Not a theatrical tear, but a leak of earth. The thing's face softened, and the top of its head crumbled like a clay pot. For one breath, the house held something like peace. It was so brief, I'm ashamed of how quickly I leaned into it like a starving animal. I reached out with both hands and touched its cheek. And the hand that touched felt like my husband's hand again, warm, rough, real. It smiled, that old smile. It said, "Take me." I understood then that the thing had no interest in mere possession. It wanted to be let in under the rule of love, not in trickery. It wanted to resume a life it had lost under a bargain it could not live under. The bargain being, the living accept me as I am. We refuse the bargain. We do not admit monsters to our table and call them guests. My daughter looked at me, and I said something I had not intended to say. I said, plain and terrible, no. I meant, not under deceit. Not as a thing disguised. When I said no, it shrieked, a noise that tore the air like a sheet ripped from a bed. The house seemed to fold. Something in the rafters gave way. When the thing vanished, it did so not in the grace of a departing ghost, but in the ugly way of a thing. Dragged back into the earth by its own hunger, a wind blew through the house, and the candles guttered back to life. When the dust settled, the kitchen smelled of rain and old coffee. The daughter and I sat in the wreckage and held each other and wept. The watches on our wrists had stopped at 3:07. On the front door, 5 fresh scratches marred the varnish in a new pattern. I do not know what they spelled. I still do not know. Sometimes I think they were letters. Sometimes I think they were simply the sound a thing makes when it leaves you broken. In the weeks that followed, the house quieted. The knocking stopped. The mirrors no longer fogged with words. The cane's tapping was heard once, like a memory, on the edge of a dream. Harold never came back again in any form I could see. My daughter and I slept, though not easily. People stopped coming to stand and peer through the windows. The town went back to its slow motions, but you do not come out of something like that unchanged. The marks on my door are a map I carry in the palm of my life. Sometimes a neighbor will ask me at the post office how I am, and I will look at them and say, "I survived." They will nod in a way that is kind but thin. The truth I carry is heavier than the polite nods. There are days I wonder if I made the right choice. If I had opened the door. If I had let whatever it was, man or trick, come in and sit in the chair by the fire. Would my daughter have been safer? Would I have been less lonely? Those are the midnight questions that have no good answers. I will not pretend regret does not gnaw. It does. But when we weigh the cost of being hospitable to something that eats souls, I am grateful my daughter and I are here. To those of you watching who live in Ohio, tell me what you know. Tell me if your town has that hour. Tell me about the old houses that cling to their dead. Write it in the comments. I want to read your stories. The machine of this world likes to divide people between the skeptics and the believers. I do not care which side you are on. Tell me what you saw. When you do, others are emboldened to tell their own truth. Before I close, there is one small human thing to say. After the house fell quiet for good, my daughter planted by the front door a little yellow rose bush. It grows by the scratched gap, and every year it gives a single small blossom. I tend that rose bush as a piece of a bargain I made with life. I would not let the terror take the beauty too. I water it in the morning. The smell is clean. If this story shook you, hit like. If you want more confessions like this, subscribe and ring the bell so you do not miss the next story. In the comments, tell us, have you ever heard a sound at 3:07? Have you lived near an old Ohio farmhouse that keeps its own secrets? Do you think I made the right choice in refusing to open the door? One last thing, because I'm old and there are things one owes to the living. If you have someone you love who listens to nothing but the world's noise, call them today. Tell them you love them. Leave the light on for them. That is perhaps the only charm that works against the long, slow nights.